Good evening. My name is Bill Scholes, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors of the Ford Hall Forum, as well as your moderator this evening. Tonight, it's a delight to introduce Professor Stephen Carter, who will be sharing his thoughts this evening on the topic of freedom of religion and the Constitution in the United States. Professor Carter's latest book is entitled The Culture of Disbelief: How American Law and Politics Trivialize Religious Devotion. As many of you know, I suspect, tonight is part of a week-long celebration of the First Amendment sponsored by Boston's Freedom Festival. And as Proctor has just said so eloquently, the Ford Hall Forum has long been dedicated to the ideals of the First Amendment. Sometimes our speakers have been controversial ones, but sometimes it is controversy itself which signals the most important issues of our times. Let me note before we begin this evening's program that the next Ford Hall Forum will be held right here next Thursday, a week from tonight, October 14th, again at 7 o'clock, and the speaker will be the Reverend Al Sharpton, who will be discussing the state of the American civil rights movement and what this nation must do to ensure equality for all its citizens. And now to this evening's program. Stephen L. Carter is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law at Yale University, where he has taught since 1982. His fields of expertise include constitutional law, intellectual property, and contracts. After graduating from Stanford University and Yale Law School, Professor Carter served as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. Professor Carter's previous book, Reflections of an Affirmative Action Baby, was published to critical and wide acclaim. In addition, he has published many articles on constitutional law and other related subjects, and he is now at work on a book about the confirmation process undergone by Supreme Court and Cabinet nominees. I'm pleased to introduce to you Professor Stephen Carter.
Thank you very much. Let me begin with an apology. I have a kind of a sore throat, and it's possible my voice will fade in and out. If it's fading out, if you raise your hand somewhere and let me know you can't hear me, I will speak louder if I can and stop talking if I cannot. The problem that I want to talk about tonight, in keeping with my own interest in religion and the week-long celebration of the First Amendment, is the state of religious freedom under the American Constitution in the 1990s. And in particular, whether the Supreme Court is doing a good job, a fair job, or a poor job of policing the right that is mentioned first among First Amendment freedoms. My thesis in these remarks will be that the Supreme Court has made a very bad wrong turning in its understanding of the religion clauses of the First Amendment, and in particular in its understanding of the separation of church and state. And because of that wrong turning, religions that are not widely engaged in, religious traditions that lie outside the mainstream, are actually at very serious threat from American politics. Whereas large and powerful religions, and here I refer to political power, politically powerful religions are at no threat from the First Amendment as the Supreme Court has recently conceived it. What that means, in effect, is that we are entering a world, unless there is correction, in which there will be less religious pluralism, less religious diversity, and a renewed domination of American politics as well as religious life by its mainline faiths. Now, I say that without meaning any criticism of mainline faiths. I'm an Episcopalian, after all, I'm a Christian. Obviously, I'm in the main line in that sense. My religion is not under any political threat. But it's vitally important not to make the mistake of assuming that because one's own religious tradition seems fairly safe from state infringement, therefore religious freedom is alive and well. My argument is that religious freedom will not be alive and well in America again, if indeed it ever was, and I'm not sure it ever was, but it will not be alive and well unless the courts and the legislatures and the executive branches and all of us become committed to a richer understanding of the nature of religion, of its interaction with democracy, and of its role in the life of faith communities, a richer understanding than the one that currently seems to motivate much in our politics, but certainly seems to motivate everything in our judicial decision. If we fail to gain, I should say, that richer understanding, then we will lose out not only on the religious diversity that I mentioned, but on a vitally important source of external moral and aesthetic critique of our society. Let me talk about the Supreme Court. When religious freedom cases come before the Supreme Court, there is a particular context in which they are always most difficult to resolve, and that is the context I will mostly talk about this evening. That is in the area of what scholars tend to call accommodations of religion. An accommodation of religion is what occurred during Prohibition, when the Volstead Act, the federal statute enforcing the Prohibition Amendment, included an exception for most religious uses of wine. What that meant in effect was that people who made a claim about religious faith were able to perform an act to use a substance that no one else was allowed to use. What makes accommodations controversial, whether granted by legislatures or by courts, is precisely that aspect. They single out religions for special treatment. When a religious organization asks for an accommodation, it is saying, in effect, treat us differently in order to secure religious freedom. Now, accommodation questions have beset the nation throughout its history. In the 19th century, there were a lot of questions before the Supreme Court and before other courts and before legislatures about accommodating the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons. The Mormons were described in the 19th century by the Supreme Court of the United States as subversive of good order. And when a court uses a term like that, you understand what is meant is that people don't like the group that is said to be subversive. As many of you know, there were violent attacks on Mormons and their property by religiously inspired mobs sometimes. And the Mormons tried, among other things, to move to other areas of the country, but it didn't work. It didn't work. So they litigated in the late 19th century over their right to violate laws that prohibited the practice of polygamy, which, although it's always been controversial in Mormon theology, many believed at the time, and some still believe now, is an important article of their faith. They lost, and that was the case in which the court said that this is a group that was subversive of good order. But not everybody lost who claimed an accommodation. There used to be a statute passed in one of our great nativist eras. There was a statute that was passed in the late 19th century, and the statute provided, oddly enough, that no American, individual or corporation, could bring to the United States a foreign national with a promise of employment. Doesn't that seem like a peculiar statute? But that was one of the statutes that was passed during a particular employment scare. Well, there was this church, and it wanted to import a new minister. And so when the state made the effort to enforce the law against them, the church objected and rested on its religious freedom right. When I say it rested on its religious freedom right, what I mean is that the church said, even though there's this statute that says we, like everyone else, should not be allowed to import labor, we're a religious group, we're special, we should be treated differently. Now, at this time, as it happened, the Supreme Court agreed. The Supreme Court agreed in what was a very tragic opinion, actually. This is the opinion in a case called the Church of the Holy Trinity versus the United States, in which Justice David Brewer, who would later be the author of a book called The United States as a Christian Nation, declared that the reason to grant the exemption was the United States as a Christian nation, and this is a Christian church, and therefore the legislature couldn't possibly have meant to restrict this church's freedom to get any minister it wanted anywhere in the world to come in and run the church. Now, I don't think much of the reasoning in that case, but I do think that there is a core there that is correct. The core has nothing to do with the United States being a Christian nation, goodness knows. The core has to do with treating religions differently. Sometimes, in recent years, the Supreme Court has treated religions differently. The most famous case, maybe some of you are aware of it, maybe some of you are aware of the fact that the Old Order Amish do not send their children to school, to public schools, after 8th grade. And that was a right that was affirmed by the Supreme Court in a decision in 1972, in which the court said, for a variety of reasons that I'm going to get into shortly, time permitting, the court said, in effect, that the states had to grant an exemption from their compulsory education laws, an exemption as part of a free exercise of religion claim that would allow the Old Order Amish a right no one else in the state had, namely a right to keep their children out of school after 8th grade. Now I want to stop there before going into more recent history and explain why this is about religious freedom. That is, what does religious freedom have to do with all of these cases in which religious organizations claim for themselves rights that nobody else has? Some scholars would argue, in fact, that the separation of church and state means you cannot grant religious exemptions because that amounts to treating religious organizations better than you treat other groups. Other scholars argue that if you don't grant religious exemptions, you make the practice of religion difficult and therefore you penalize the religion. The trouble is that modern scholarship holds simultaneously that the government is not allowed to do either one. That is, you cannot treat religions better than other people, but you also cannot penalize them. But when you have an accommodation case, you have to make a choice. And that's where the problem comes in. You see, after Yoder, Wisconsin versus Yoder, I said was the name of the case involving the Old Order Amish 21 years ago. After Yoder, a problem arose. Suddenly, everybody said, we're just like the Old Order Amish. Whatever statutes there may be, our religion doesn't need them, our religion teaches something different, we shouldn't be required to follow those statutes. And one heard this over and over again. And the courts began to reject these claims. The courts began to reject them. The Old Order Amish case was in effect limited to its facts. And what limited to its facts means is that if you read a later decision describing the Yoder case, it describes it so narrowly that it's impossible that any other group would ever be able to take advantage of it. Let me tell you what's happened more recently, what's happened instead. Let me tell you about the attitude of the Supreme Court toward these cases in the last 10 years. I want to mention 3 cases. The first of the cases involved an Air Force major who, while serving on active duty and in uniform indoors, wore a yarmulke. The trouble was, of course, that military uniform regulations say that when you're indoor in full uniform, you do not wear headgear. So the Air Force, in its wisdom, decided to discipline him. He naturally brought suit, claiming that this was a First Amendment violation. He explained that the wearing of the yarmulke was required by his religious tradition. The Supreme Court, in its wisdom, said, well, that may be true, But this is the military we're talking about after all. And this is a disciplinary rule after all. And the military has to decide what causes good discipline. That's not for us, the courts, to interfere with, certainly not on something like a religious claim. So Major Goldman, that was his name, lost. There was an interesting postscript to that case. Congress overruled that decision by statute. Congress enacted a statute, but it's a very peculiar statute. The statute says that the wearing of religious apparel while on duty in uniform shall be permitted as long as the apparel is neat and conservative. That's what the statute says, neat and conservative. That's currently on the books. That's what the law says. I'm waiting for the first case with someone who explains that religion requires a turban, dreadlocks, to see if the court says, well, they said neat and conservative, that doesn't sound very conservative to us, you lose again like Major Goldman did. I have a hunch that if someone does lose in that circumstance, the Congress will not overrule. But it might do so. I hope so. Why do I hope so? I hope so not because I'm against military discipline, because I'm for religious freedom. And that's also the point of the next couple of cases I want to talk about. The saddest of these cases, and the middle one in a way, is a case called the Ling case. The Ling case involved a decision by the Forest Service to allow the building of a road and logging in an area that 3 Indian tribes held sacred. Now, it was public land. These groups of Native Americans did not own the land, but they'd been using it for sacred rituals for generations. Indeed, they argued they'd been using it for sacred rituals before there was the United States of America. So they said this violates our religious freedom. And they made a very strong claim. They said the reason this violates our religious freedom is that if this road is allowed to be built, if logging is allowed in this area, we will not be able to practice our religion at all. Our religious tradition will be entirely destroyed. Here's what the Supreme Court said. The court said yes, allowing these activities might have devastating effects. That was the court's language, devastating effects on the ability to practice the religion. But, and I quote, government simply could not operate if it were required to satisfy every citizen's religious needs and desires. And that's what lawyers call a slippery slope argument. A slippery slope argument is the argument that says, well, if we do this, we've got to do that, and if we do that, we've got to do the next thing, and so on and so on. One of my favorite comments about slippery slope arguments was made by the legal scholar Catherine McKinnon, who said that slippery slopes are always designed by people who plan to push you down one. The third case in this trend was a case that got a large amount of national publicity 3 years ago. This was the Smith case. The Smith case involved adherents of the Native American Church in the state of Oregon who used peyote in a religious ritual. Again, a religious ritual that antedated the anti-drug laws. But peyote is a controlled substance, and what they did was illegal. And so, since they were state employees, they were fired. They were denied unemployment compensation. And so they sued. They said, we're being punished for our religious practices. The state can't do that. The Supreme Court said, yes, the state can do that. Here is what the Supreme Court said in the Smith case, and this, I'm going to suggest to you, is at the heart of the problem I'm trying to describe, this attitude. It may fairly be said, the court wrote, that leaving accommodation to the political process will place at a relative disadvantage those religious practices that are not widely engaged in. But that unavoidable consequence of democratic government must be preferred to a system in which each conscience is a law unto itself, or in which judges weight the social importance of all laws against the centrality of all religious beliefs. When you translate that into ordinary English, what the Supreme Court said in that case was if your religious tradition is too small, too politically powerless to win in democratic politics, then you lose. That's what that says. You lose because the court does not want to get involved in this problem. You lose because that is an unavoidable consequence of democratic processes. Somebody has to lose. That's what democracy is. That's the nub of that opinion. The opinion, I suggest to you, was written as though the First Amendment of the Constitution does not exist. The argument that says if you lose, could be used to defeat any constitutional right claim. You could go say, well, the schools are racially segregated. And the court could say, yes, but that's an unavoidable consequence of democratic politics. There was an election and your side lost. It's not an argument. It's a description of a state of affairs. The question is whether it's a good state of affairs or a bad one, and I would suggest it's a bad one. It's a bad one if you believe in religious freedom. Because think back for a moment about the Ling case. It is simply true that the Forest Service or any other government agency is not going to build a road through an area that is considered of great religious importance to powerful mainline faiths like mine, the Episcopal Church, for instance. It simply will not happen. It will not happen because of political clout. Consider the Smith case. It is simply true that the government of the United States or any subdivision thereof would never try to outlaw the religious use of wine in the name of prohibition. Those religions can protect themselves, and in that sense may have less of a need of a free exercise right. The trouble with the court's approach to these cases is that politics is not a solution for religions that exist on the margins. Politics is the problem for religions that exist on the margin. Religions that are not widely engaged in, as the court puts it, are going to lose. And the court's attitude is generally, that's just fine. Now, I say generally. There was a lot of publicity to a case the Supreme Court decided this past spring. And you might say this case represents a different attitude. This is the case involving Santeria. This is a case from Hialeah, Florida. Santeria, for those of you not familiar with it, is a religion that involves a fusion of Roman Catholic traditions and Yoruba traditions. And one of the practices in which it sometimes engages is animal sacrifice. The city of Hialeah decided to outlaw the Yoruba religion. When I say they decided to outlaw the Yoruba religion, that's exactly what I mean. You might say, animal sacrifice, that's very cruel. I don't believe in harming animals. I don't believe in harming animals either. I also think it's cruel. But understand what happened in this case. The city of Hialeah, in its ordinances, allows animals to be hunted and blown to bits. It allows rabbits to be torn to bits by greyhounds who are learning to race. It allows people who happen to own animals to kill them for no other reason but that they own them. Indeed, it allows so many things. The only thing it does not allow is for adherents of Santeria to practice animal sacrifice. You can kill animals for any other purpose you want in Hialeah, Florida, except that one. So the Supreme Court struck down that law, but it struck it down very carefully. You see, the court didn't treat it as an accommodation case. So it wasn't like Smith and Ling and these other cases. It would have been an accommodation case had it involved a claim by a religious tradition that involves animal sacrifice, a claim against a general anti-cruelty to animal statutes. This was not an anti-cruelty to animal statute. This was an anti-Santeria statute. And the court struck it down on that ground. The court said, look, this is a statute that's only directed at this religion. And that clearly is unconstitutional. Indeed, I suppose everyone would agree that the state cannot put itself in the business of trying to put a particular religion away. But the Supreme Court nowadays seems to treat the matter as though that's the only thing the Free Exercise Clause protects. The only free exercise right is that the state cannot enact a statute aimed explicitly at your particular religious tradition. But anything else is fine. Anything else is fine. Now, what's wrong with anything else being fine? That is, when I say anything else is fine, what I mean is this, that the rule is as long as the state does not adopt a statute aimed at you, as long as your religious tradition is simply seeking an exemption from a law that applies to everybody else, that raises no significant constitutional issues. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, I suggest there, pardon me, I suggest there are two things that are wrong with that. One is that that has a notion of religion that is in many ways stereotypical, trivializing, and I would say destructive in important ways of democratic politics. The second reason is that that's an almost incompetent reading of the Free Exercise Clause and its history. But let me talk more about the first of these than the second. I don't want to bog us down in history. Let me talk about why the trend I've described in the cases is damaging and, in my view, trivializing to religion. The way to trivialize religious belief is to treat it like every other belief. Now, you might say, what's so trivial about that? Beliefs are important, conscience is important, these are clearly fundamental constitutional rights. And of course, that's true. Belief is important, conscience is important. Religion is not necessarily a higher constitutional right, it is simply different. Let me explain two ways in which it's different, explain how the court has ignored them. One way in which it's different is that for many believing members of a wonderful variety of faith traditions, religion is not simply something one believes or chooses. It is a deep, motivating force in the person's life, in the person's moral analysis, in the person's cultural and aesthetic analysis of the world. It is also a deeply nurturing aspect of human personality as well. Now, when you look at religion that way, and understand how deeply and intimately connected to human personality it is, or can be, then you see there's an interesting problem. Because the subtext of a case like Ling, where the court says it's just too bad if the Forest Service destroys your religious tradition, the subtext is, get serious, it's just a religious tradition. If this one is destroyed, you can pick another one. There's a lot of them out there, and you can pick one that is not destroyed. There are other cases that have this attitude. There's a case called Thornton versus the State of Caldor, in which the Supreme Court held unconstitutional a Connecticut statute that required all employers to allow their employees to take their religious Sabbath day off. Now, I don't have a strong view that I want to argue here on whether the statute is a good statute or a bad statute. I simply want to say something about what one of the justices said in an opinion in that case. One justice said, the problem with this statute is that everybody would like the right to choose a day off. So the problem with that analysis is, again, it says religion is your choice, you see. You've just picked your religion because it has a convenient Sabbath day. That's how you decide which religious tradition to follow. You liked Saturday, you liked Sunday, you liked whatever the Sabbath day was of a religion, that's how you picked it. Well, this is, again, a deeply trivializing way of looking at religious faith. That's what I call sometimes treating religion like a hobby. Something you pick, you get bored, you pick a new one. It shouldn't be so important that you're going to move mountains, litigate over it. If it gets to be hard to do it, if there are no more model airplanes in the store and you're a model airplane collector, if model airplanes become illegal, you pick a different hobby. That's the attitude that underlies the ability of the courts to say it's just politics, because that suggests that the destruction of religion is unimportant. Unimportant, presumably, because you can always pick a new one. That's the first problem. The first problem of the court's view of religion. The second problem of the court's view of religion, and in some ways I think a more fundamental problem, is one that is shared in common with not only the courts, but our politics sometimes as well. And that is the problem of failing to recognize, or perhaps not wanting to recognize, that the Supreme Court was exactly right in the Reynolds case when it referred to the Mormons because of their unpopularity, because of their differences, as subversive of good order. Religion is potentially, and I would say ought to be, a very subversive force in society. And when I say subversive, I'm not talking about Waco, Texas. I'm talking about the notion of a community of believers working together to try to bring some meaning to the maddening moral complexity of the modern world. And as a result of that effort to think through issues of what some call ultimate concern, coming to a construction of reality that is different from the construction that has been agreed on by that powerful group of individuals to whom we refer as the state. This is a role which is vital for progress in any society. The group of believers, think of the group as a community of resistance, as some theologians say. Think of religious resistance. Think of a group of believers thumbing its nose at the state and saying, we have a different view. Now the state might say, that's too bad, you lose, we're crushing you. The state might say, that's too bad, you're crazy, we're ignoring you. Those things happen, and sometimes they should. And sometimes the state says, you know, you've got a point, let's listen. Most of the movements in our nation's history that I at least would identify with progressive change have either been based in religious communities, been largely led by religious leaders, or have been awash in religious rhetoric. This is true famously of the abolitionist movement. It's true famously of the civil rights movement. It is also true of the 19th century suffragist movement. It is also true of the early 20th century labor movement. It is also true of the progressive movement at the turn of the century. It is also, of course, true of the anti-war movement. What all of those movements have in common is they represent communities of resistance. Religious communities reasoning together, coming to a different construction of reality, and saying to the state, you have one set of meanings you want to impose, we have a different one. Now, sometimes when this happens, as I said, religious groups will be ignored. That's fine. To say that religious groups can serve and should serve this important function in a democracy of the external moral critic who has a different view, that doesn't mean they should win all the time. Who knows if they'll win? They'll win if their rhetoric resonates with a larger audience than the audience of their own tradition. When I talk about this, people say to me, well, obviously you're talking about the Christian Coalition and Pat Robertson and so on. My answer is no, I'm not. No, I'm not. And the reason I'm not is not clearly, the Christian Coalition, Operation Rescue, all engage in religious resistance. And I think religious resistance is to be encouraged whether you like the cause or not. But if the rhetoric, the cause, don't resonate, they're not going to win. They're not going to win. So what I'm talking about is the ability to speak, not the ability to win. The ability to speak, but not just ability. You see, we as a democratic society should encourage, we should nurture this role. How, after all, do you avoid tyranny of the majority? How do you avoid having a world, a nation that is called a democracy, how do you avoid the democracy deteriorating into a system in which every aspect of society is ordered as 51% of the people prefer? The answer has to be, number one, that you make a space for individual freedom. And that's what our Constitution tries to do. But you know, when you make a space for individual freedom, that is still ultimately a government construct, because when you think your freedom is threatened, you go to court. We sometimes forget it, but the courts are also part of the state. No, the other way that you try to avoid that tyranny is to encourage the development and to carefully nurture the existence of organizations, institutions, groups, and they don't all have to be religious, that stand apart from society and are not easily subject to its whims. Now, if you don't do that, If you say, well, there are these laws out there and everyone has to do what they say and that's the end of the matter, then you're really saying you don't want challenges to the state. You don't want resistance, religion or other kind. You just want, as long as you're in charge of the apparatus of the state, you want to win. And when you're not in charge of the apparatus of the state, you want to control the courts. This is not a very attractive vision of democracy. This is a very statist vision of society. It says there should be some powerful governmental institution to help you win. What's wrong with having a powerful or influential or not very powerful but very appealing external moral critic to help you win? That's what you nurture when you nurture accommodations. Which is why my suggestion to the Supreme Court, not the Supreme Court has ever listened to me in the past, there's no reason they should start now, but my suggestion to the Supreme Court is that the state, before it can trespass, especially on the central articles of a faith, be required to show a very strong, perhaps a compelling interest in enforcing its law against this religious entity. And if it can't show that, then the accommodation ought to be granted. In my view, that approach would very easily dispose, for example, of the Ling case that I mentioned, the case involving the Native Americans who were trying to prevent the building of the road through grounds that were sacred to them and who were going to have their religion destroyed. I think we'd have a very hard time showing a compelling state interest in building that road to that location to cut those trees. The Smith case is harder, I admit, the case involving peyote. While I would probably come out, as the court did not, on the side of the adherents of the Native American Church, I do think you could make a respectable case for the compellingness of the anti-drug statutes. I don't agree with the case when it conflicts with a core religious freedom like that, but it's a respectable one. I think it's a perfectly respectable one, and I certainly see it. Well, so far, I've talked about religions not widely engaged in. I want to talk about a couple more religions that are not widely engaged in that some people think are widely engaged in. Because there's one area where this accommodation question always raises the most ire, and that, of course, is the public schools. Public schools. Now, the public schools, I think it's fair to say that a proper understanding of the separation of church and state means, for example, you should not have organized classroom prayer. Now, I know organized classroom prayer is very popular. 62% of the American people say they want it, and a substantial additional percentage say they could live with it. Those are not against it. But I think it's a very poor idea. And it's a poor idea because it runs against religious freedom. But it runs against religious freedom in a very important way. It runs against religious freedom because it gets the state involved in telling people when to pray, whether to pray, or how to pray, especially at the most impressionable time when they're children. I know there are many people who feel strongly that it's vitally important that prayer be a part of the school day in order to reinforce a set of moral teachings. I understand and respect that view. I only ask those who hold that view understand the way in which it can infringe on religious freedom by involving the state in these choices. I mention this before I get to the more difficult issues about the schools because I think it's very important to realize when you talk about the separation of church and state, the enemy that the doctrine of the separation of church and state, the metaphor of the separation of church and state, is protecting against, the enemy is not religion. The enemy is the state. It's important to realize that. This is part of the Bill of Rights. The metaphor of separation of church and state is drawn from the Establishment Clause of the Constitution and the Free Exercise Clause. It was not, those clauses were not drafted to penalize religious organizations. Those clauses were drafted to prevent the state from getting involved and telling people what they should be doing religiously. Now, the reason I mention that is because there are a number of issues that arise in the schools where this is a very hot topic. Religious accommodations come up typically in a case like this. A parent says, I don't want my child to be in the sex education class. I don't want my child to participate in the condom distribution program. I don't want my child to learn the theory of evolution. And the list could go on and on. The reason that's an accommodation question is because the parent is really saying is, I want my child, for religious reasons, to be excused from courses of instruction that other people are required to take. My view is that it's important to allow parents to make judgments like that. And the degree to which you think it's important really goes to the issue of how important you think religion is. I was on a radio talk show not long ago, and someone called in. And she said, I heard you say a few minutes ago that you and your wife are raising your children in your religion. I said, yes, that's right. She said, how dare you? How dare you? She said, they are too impressionable. You should wait until they're 18 and tell them about all the religious traditions and let them pick one. She said, I'm not often at a loss for words, but I didn't know quite what to say. I admit I do have a bias here. I do believe in the right of parents to raise their children in their religious tradition. I don't believe in the right of parents to do physical harm to their children because of their religious traditions, but to raise their children in their faith, to want that to be the basis of their lives, I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. Indeed, I think it's an important thing. And from the surveys, most parents think it's an important thing too. I emphasize the most parents' point for this reason. The public schools are public schools. They're there to serve. Now, I don't think it would be appropriate for parents to say that because of my religious belief, nobody should be able to have a condom distribution program, nobody should have a sex education class, nobody should study the theory of evolution. That would be much too much. But I do think it would be appropriate to say, my children shouldn't have to do it. And you know why? Because of the separation of church and state. Didn't I say a minute ago that the enemy that the separation of church and state is aimed at is the government and not religion? See, the problem with school prayer, to go back to that, is that it's indoctrinating. It violates the children's religious liberty by indoctrinating them. This is the way to do it. Well, if you think about it, and a course of instruction that is objectionable in the terms of the parent's religion has much the same effect, doesn't it? It's indoctrinating. It's saying this is the way to do it. Not the way you're being taught at home, but this other way instead. This is what you have to know. Now, when I say this, that I think parents should have a broad right to opt their children out from objectionable instruction, I always get the nation of dunces question. If that's the case, nobody's going to learn anything. Every parent will keep their children home from something. Some children will keep home from everything. Nobody will learn everything. It'll be a disaster. Everybody will be stupid. Well, interesting argument. Let me say what I think is wrong with it. Empirically, I very much doubt that this would happen. Those schools that do allow kids to opt out don't usually have these problems, except with a few very controversial programs. Most parents seem to want their kids to get a good education. I haven't heard of any places where the parents are trying to opt their children out of algebra and trigonometry or calculus, although that may happen in some places. So I think the nation of dunces thing may be exaggerated, but there's a further problem too. It's a further problem. If it were true that 85% of parents would take their kids out of these classes if they could, that suggests a profoundly undemocratic character to the classes themselves. So it's not a problem that's going to happen unless there's something wrong with the classes. I don't happen to think there is something wrong. I don't think most parents are going to take their kids out. But I think you have to preserve that sphere to allow parents on some important issues to make that judgment. Because if you don't do that, then what you're saying is religion is not very important. It's just something you're learning at home. We have something much more important to teach you in school. This is far more important than your parents' religious tradition. Learn this, not that. And the parents will say, shut up. That's what I mean by trivializing religion, saying it's not that important, it's not as important as this other end we're trying to meet. When I say that that approach trivializes religion, I don't mean religion is the most important thing in the world necessarily. I don't mean other issues, other interests are not important as well. I only insist on the importance of religion alongside a number of other issues. Now, I realize I've talked a long time. I'm actually pleased by that, because I told you that my throat was bothering me, but this has been, my voice seems to be getting louder, not softer. I don't know if you feel that way or not. I've talked a long time. I'm not going to go on much longer. What I'm going to do instead, and I have additional points I'd like to make about politics, but I'll leave those to the question period if there are any questions. But I do want to make a couple of closing points. I've focused on the Supreme Court and on the Constitution because that, after all, is the theme. But I don't want you to think that I think that the kind of attitude about the relative unimportance of religion in people's lives is confined to the Supreme Court. It's actually a fairly common attitude. The reason I think it's important to change that attitude, well, there are a lot of reasons. The one reason I think it's important to change that attitude is because if we don't change that attitude, it becomes far more difficult for religions to serve as the external moral critics that I've advocated. The more trivial, the more unimportant religion is, the less reason there is to listen to anybody's religious rhetoric. If we understand that religion matters, and if we take a view of society that says we value it, then suddenly there's every reason for the Supreme Court to give a sensible construction to the First Amendment, and thereby to say that we will not allow the state to interfere with the central tenets of a religion unless the state has a very strong interest. Now you might say, wow, who wants the Supreme Court in the business of deciding what's really important to religion and what's not? But the answer is that if you're going to protect religious freedom, there may be no alternative to that. Or I should say, if the alternative to that is to say that marginal religions always lose, then it seems to me the cost of having the Supreme Court sort out and say some of them should win is a relatively small one. Because make no mistake, when you talk about marginalized religions, religions outside the main line, politically powerless ones, you're not necessarily talking about groups that will go quietly into oblivion. And I'm not sure they should. I think that if the state were to threaten my religious tradition and to say, in effect, I couldn't practice, I would certainly be willing to take up arms against such an oppressive state. And so it's hard to explain to a practitioner of another religion why she or he should not do that. That's another meaning of the word subversive. It's a very scary one to me, I hope to most of you as well, but it's one that doesn't have to have anything to do with life in the United States. I really believe that if we understand these points, if we come to value religion both as an important force in people's lives and as an important source of moral critique, and if we come to nurture religious communities again, that this proper understanding of our constitutional traditions and of the separation of church and state can lead us to a future with a more glorious tradition of religious freedom and a more glorious tradition of religious pluralism for as long as America endures. And I thank you very much.
Many, many thanks to Professor Carter for this stimulating presentation tonight. And now is the time that we offer an opportunity to you in the audience to ask your questions of Professor Carter. This program is being taped for cablecast, so I would ask anyone with questions to come here to the center microphone for their questions or comments. And at the same time, I want to note that The Culture of Disbelief, Professor Carter's book, is available for purchase after the program at the gift shop here, and Professor Carter has kindly agreed to make himself available, at least for a few minutes, to sign copies of the books. Now, let's move to the questions. Yes, sir.
It seems to me that you...
I can't quite hear you, I'm sorry.
It seems to me that you have ignored the Constitution. a properly motivated majority of voters can do anything they want to with the Constitution, an appropriate majority. I presume you agree. They could amend the Constitution. They could establish any religious requirements they want to, or they could prohibit any religious practices they want to. Doesn't the Supreme Court and the legislature have to at least consider, within the limits of what they try to do, the fact that there is a large group of people who vote who in fact might, if provoked, do that kind of thing? And if I could just add one more constitutional point that I think you may be aware of. As I understand it, when the clause, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, really was intended to protect religions which were established at that time. I presume you are aware of that. And what they were really doing was, in the free exercise thereof, tolerating other religions. I have a feeling, I don't know what the thinking is in this, but they really expected that this would be a Christian nation, and that would tolerate other nations, other religions, perhaps with the hope of converting them.
Okay, let's give Professor Carter a chance.
I think these are good. Can you hear me? Is that working okay? No, not this one.
You may have to stand up here.
Well, maybe I'll choose this mic. Well, you raised some good points. Let me just respond briefly to two of them. Of course, it is the case that a properly motivated majority can amend the Constitution, although it's been very hard to do that. Some very popular constitutional amendments, like the Equal Rights Amendment, or for that matter, amendments to overturn the school prayer decisions, have failed, even though they've had overwhelming public support. So, of course, it's true that the Constitution can be amended, and if it's amended, the court needs to enforce whatever Constitution it ends up with. But until it's amended, I think the court needs to enforce the rights that are there, and the last thing the court should be doing, in my view, is to be altering or backing off from constitutional rights because somebody might overrule it later on. If I just finish this. On the second point, it is correct, I think historically, to say that the clause that says Congress shall make no law respecting any establishment of religion was intended by those who wrote it, to avoid interference by the national government with the efforts of various states to maintain established churches. Of course, the established churches were already on the run by that time. The last one was abolished in 1808. But nevertheless, that's certainly what it was for. Without getting into the issue here of the extent to which the intent of the founders should bind us in their own constitutional decision-making, let me just say that the argument that I've made about the separation of church and state does not rest on the Establishment Clause, it rests on the Free Exercise Clause. As my concern about separation is that you make room for religious diversity. I think you are probably correct that there was an era in our history when religious diversity was tolerated because of a hope of conversion. I think that's absolutely correct historically, but I think it's a terrible thing. I think it's a terrible thing because you don't have a truly pluralistic nation unless you actually value your diversity. To say we want diversity only so that we can get rid of it is simply to me a very scary idea, but I think you're right that that was once the ideal held by many Americans.
Yes, sir.
I think you've addressed my question with response again to an earlier question about what happens when a religion presumes to run the state, to take over the state apparatus. But I want to draw the implications of this at the international level. I'm thinking of states, non-Western states, for which secularism is a form of modernity which infringes on their religious traditions and convictions. And I'm wondering if you would then, if one of the implications of your perspective would be that secularism is a precondition for democracy. That is, that you must, that for democracy to flourish, you cannot have a religious state which dominates minorities and imposes its own view over the entire functioning of the state. Is it possible to have democracy flourish with where religions run the state apparatus, or is secularism a precondition for democracy?
That's one of the tough questions that always comes up. Let me say a couple of things about that. I don't mean to suggest that Well, I don't want to get into an argument about words. Secularism wasn't necessarily what I'm describing when I say religious pluralism. That is, I think we agree on the concept. It's just the word secularism bothers me a little bit. I think it is certainly conceivable in theory to have a functioning democracy that has an established church, an established faith of some kind, and is respectful, genuinely respectful of minority religion. I think that is possible in theory. I think it's very difficult to imagine in practice. It's not that it can't be done, and maybe some places it isn't, but it's very, very hard. And it's hard for several reasons. I mean, it's hard for the practical political reason that if you have a truly established church, then nobody who's not involved in that faith is going to have any political power in that country, for all they may enjoy economic power or powers of some other kind. And so that will set up this bifurcated state where people of the dominant faith will hold all the power. They may tolerate, they may even respect other faiths, but there'll still always be the sense that it's by their forbearance, and that can be a bad thing for democracy because it can encourage other faiths to feel, in some sense, second-rate. But it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. It seems to me it's possible to do it, but it's really hard. It's really hard. In the American tradition, it would be especially bad to do it because one of the things that's been most welcoming about America is the insistence on religious pluralism, that the ideal, it doesn't always work out in practice, but the ideal is you should be able to come to America with any religious tradition or begin a religious tradition in America and have it respected, have it not demonized or trivialized. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes traditions are demonized or trivialized, but at least we have the constitutional and philosophical language that makes that mutual respect possible. I think in a state that has an established religion, whether by law or by practice, it's much harder to develop the rhetorical traditions of the way you talk about constitutionalism and the way you talk about politics and the way you talk about philosophy that make it, the rhetorical traditions that are, in my view, absolutely essential if you're going to have true religious pluralism.
Thank you.
And join me now in thanking Professor Carter this evening.